Some people don't come into your life by chance. They arrive after observing you, even before the first real conversation, before proximity, before interests seem mutual, they were already looking. And there is something unsettling about that, because while you believe it all started with a chance encounter, one comment, innocent or seemingly natural conversation, for some people, the process it started much earlier, silently, observing. Maybe you never noticed. But think for a moment. How many times has someone shown you to understand you too quickly, as if he had captured their weaknesses, their tastes, their fears, and even their insecurities with an almost uncomfortable precision? It didn't feel like effort. It felt like connection. But there is one detail that almost no one notices. Real connection usually takes time, but some people learn you. They watch how you react to small frustrations, how you talk when you're nervous, how you try to please. How do you explain yourself when you think you did something wrong? And mainly, how do you deal with rejection? Now stop for a second and be honest with yourself. Have you ever felt like someone seemed to read your mind? That someone knew exactly what to say to gain your trust? Not because it was deep, but because it was necessary. There is a kind of coolness that doesn't scream. She calculates. And contrary to what many people imagine, cold people rarely start out being distant or aggressive. In fact, many of them start out being exactly the opposite. Pay attention, interested, gifts, almost fascinated by you. But while you feel like you finally found someone who understands you, that person could be doing something completely different. She might be studying you, observing what makes you let your guard down, what makes you open up, what makes you trust. And the most curious thing, it's just that you often provide the information she needs yourself, without realizing it. You tell stories from the past, talk about disappointments, reveal who hurt you, explain what you always wanted to find in someone. And in that moment, everything seems like just talk, replacement, intimacy. But for some very cold minds, this is reading material, emotional map, a guide. Because before choosing someone to really get close to, some people do something that almost no one notices. They evaluate. They assess how much you need to be accepted. They assess how much you fear losing someone. They assess how willing you are to ignore strange signals to maintain a connection. Now comes the uncomfortable part. Sometimes, what you called immediate chemistry. It wasn't chemistry. It was a well-made observation. And if you're here now, listening to this, maybe there's a reason. Perhaps some experience in the past has left a feeling that is difficult to explain. That strange feeling that someone always seemed one step ahead of you. If anything like this has ever happened to you, keep it in mind as we continue. Because this space does not exist for superficial entertainment. Those here generally want to understand something deeper about behavior human, about the masks, about the patterns that go unnoticed. And throughout this conversation, you may begin to notice something unsettling. Emotionally cold people almost never act on impulse. They wait, observe, test, and only then do they decide. The real question is not whether these people exist. The question is different. How many times has someone watched you before choosing to get closer? Because understanding this changes the way you look at certain connections. And next moment, we will dismantle one of the biggest misconceptions about cold people, because what many people call coldness is actually something much more calculated than what it looks like. The most common mistake is to imagine that a cold person is always easy to identify, as if the coldness was accompanied by a hard face, a cruel tone, dry gestures, of an obviously threatening presence. But it's almost never like that. This is the point that confuses so many people. Because the most dangerous coldness doesn't seem cold at first. She seems stable, controlled, mature, even admirable. And that's exactly what she goes through. You find someone who doesn't despair, doesn't expose themselves too much, doesn't show lack, does not react with visible intensity. Someone who seems very safe, very centered, very in charge of himself. In an emotionally chaotic world, this can seem like strength. It may feel like balance. It may even seem like protection. But there is a huge difference between emotional balance and calculated detachment. An emotionally mature person feels, elaborates, takes responsibility, and connects without invade. A cold person, when acting strategically, may appear calm, but not because he found peace within himself. And yes, because he learned to use his own absence of turbulence as an advantage over those who feel too much. This changes everything. Because suddenly, what seems solid begins to reveal another layer. The calm, it no longer seems like virtue. And it starts to look like an instrument. People like this don't need to show malice to cause harm. Often, they make an impact precisely because they understand one thing very clearly. Whoever maintains visible emotional control often dominates the dynamic. Whoever reacts least observes more. Those who expose themselves less discover more. Who talks little about themselves but listens a lot over the other, it accumulates silent power. And you may have already seen this without giving it that name. That person who seemed to listen to you deeply, but you never knew about. Very true. That presence that asked the right questions, in the right tone, at the right time, and at the same time remained protected behind a clean, functional, almost impeccable. Nothing screamed danger. That's the problem. Because common sense has taught many people to look for noisy threats, explosive personalities, obvious signs, visible exaggerations. But some of the cooler dynamics begin in the complete opposite. In education, in restraint, in reading, patient from the environment. And here a lot of people get lost. Because it confuses self-control with moral depth, confuses presence with bond, confuses attention with care. Not every reserved person is cold. Not every cold person will be manipulative. But when the coldness mixes with instrumental interest, a type of interaction that is difficult to detect is born. An interaction in which the other does not approach to share humanity, but to understand where you give in, where you break, where you need to be seen. And then the question stops being, does this person feel little? The real question becomes something else. What does this person do with what they feel, or what they don't feel? Because there are people who use emotional reading as a bridge, and there are people who use emotional reading as a tool. This difference is subtle on the outside, but devastating inside. Maybe that's why so many people only realize it too late. Because at first it didn't seem coldness, it felt like relief. I seemed to find someone less confused, less dramatic, less unstable than others. Only then comes the strangeness. Only later do you realize that all that calm did not create acceptance. It created an advantage. And from here things get even more uncomfortable. Because when someone cold decides to really watch you, they're not just trying to get you know. It's trying to understand how you work. This is where many people make a dangerous mistake. Because observing is not the same as caring. At first glance, it may seem like the same thing. After all, whoever observes pays attention, remembers details, notices changes, notices what others ignore. This is often interpreted as genuine interest, like sensitivity, as presence. But in certain people, observation is not born of affection. It comes from reading. And reading, when not accompanied by empathy, can become a silent weapon. Cold people who operate in a calculated way rarely enter a relationship without before capturing patterns. They don't need much. Small behaviors already say enough. The way you respond to a delay. The way you change the tone when you want approval. The ease with which you justify the mistakes of others. The impulse to fill silences. The rush to explain that it is not difficult to deal with. All this speaks. Very. You may think you are just being spontaneous. But for someone who reads people instrumentally, spontaneity is raw material. That's where she starts to put the puzzle together. Who are you when you feel ignored? Who are you when you fear losing space? What makes you insist? What makes you back off? What triggers your guilt? What awakens your hope? What makes you believe that this time will be different? These questions are not always asked out loud. Often they are answered by their own conduct. That's the disturbing detail. The cold person doesn't need to get your secrets out. She just needs to create small situations enough to see you react. A brief disappearance, an ambiguous answer, a very compliment accurate. A sudden show of interest followed by distance. One comment that touches exactly on an insecurity of yours, but in a light enough way to seem coincidence. And then she watches. If you run after, if you keep quiet, if you try to compensate, if you doubt yourself, if you start making too much effort to preserve something that you don't even know what it is yet, this is how certain profiles discover where the gateway is. Not what you say it is, but in what you reveal when you are slightly destabilized. This explains why some connections feel intense so early on. Not because there was real depth, but because someone quickly realized which emotional buttons produce more response in you. Lack, fear of abandonment, need for validation, desire to be finally understood, desire to prove that he deserves to stay, and before you know it, the dynamic has already changed levels. Because while you think is being seen in a rare way, someone may be just cataloging how it works. Cold like that, no fuss, no rush. This is why many people leave this type of relationship with a confused feeling, difficult to understand. Explain. It wasn't exactly an attack. There was not necessarily obvious cruelty at the beginning. What happened was a very clean entry, too quick access. One familiarity that felt like magic, but was perhaps built on observation strategic. And here is something even more uncomfortable. Most of the time, the target helps. Unintentionally, of course, but it helps. Because when we feel welcomed, we tend to talk more. When we feel perceived, we open parts that we would normally protect. When someone seems to touch our pains without judgment, the guard comes down, and that is human. That doesn't make anyone naive. Makes someone alive. It makes someone open to connection. But not every listener deserves access. Keep that sentence. Not every listener deserves access. Because in the next step, what these people do is not just observe their weaknesses. They start to decide if you are worth the effort. There is a dangerous illusion in the way people understand intense approaches. They think being chosen means being special. But in certain dynamics, being chosen just means being viable. And that's hard to accept, because it touches on a very human need, to believe that when someone he notices us strongly, he really sees us, that there was something rare there, something deep, something almost inevitable. But cold people, when they observe before approaching, are not necessarily looking for depth. They are looking for a return, emotional return, psychological return, social return, sometimes even practical returns. They evaluate where the investment will be most profitable. Yes, that word bothers. But here it is important. Lucrative, not in the simple sense of money, although in some cases that exists too. Profitable in the sense of control, ease, access, admiration, usefulness, emotional availability. The silent question is not who suits me, but who can I operate with better? Do you notice the difference? A bond search. The other seeks advantage, and almost always this choice does not happen on impulse. It happens after a reading cold about your profile, about how much you tolerate ambiguity, about how much you insist even without clear reciprocity, about how much you need to feel like you finally found it someone different, about how much you confuse intensity with truth. That's where the selection happens. Not everyone is interested. Very cold people, when they act strategically, tend to avoid those who impose limits early, who observes inconsistencies, who does not reveal too much at the beginning, who maintains silence without rushing to fill the void. Because these profiles require more work. They require more coherence. They offer fewer loopholes. On the other hand, anyone who shows a hunger for connection too quickly can be read as accessible land. And this is not a criticism of those who feel. It's exactly the opposite. Many good, honest, and affectionate people fall into this, not because of weakness, but because they still believe that transparency meets transparency, that presence meets presence. What interest? You don't always find it. Sometimes you find calculus. And here comes an uncomfortable question. What if that feeling of immediate chemistry wasn't born out of deep affinity, but of behavioral accuracy? What if the person hadn't guessed you because you were special, but because you were observing with surgical attention? This changes a lot of people's memories. Because suddenly certain old scenes take on another meaning. The way he seemed to know the exact time to approach. The way he backed away just enough to awaken your search. The ability to say just what you needed to hear when was about to walk away. Nothing seemed aggressive. Everything seemed to fit. This is the most treacherous point. When the fit is not born of real reciprocity, but of strategic reading, it still produces a feeling of destiny. And people vulnerable to this type of dynamic, they often don't realize the risk because it doesn't hurt at first. The beginning seduces. Organize. Calm down. It makes sense. Only then comes the price. Only later do you understand that you were not chosen because you were irreplaceable. It was chosen because it was accessible in a specific way. And that brings us to the next step, perhaps the most subtle of all. After choosing, the cool person does not accelerate too much. She starts testing the signs that almost no one notices. The most dangerous signs almost never seem dangerous when they happen. This is one of the reasons why so many people only understand the type of person too late. Who he was dealing with. There wasn't a big scene at the beginning. There was not a blatant evil. There were little things so discreet that, isolated, seem irrelevant. But together, they reveal a pattern. The person those who observe before choosing almost always dominate this gray area. She knows that excess scares, so offer little at a time. An interest that seems rare but never fully indulged. A listening sound profound, but which raises more questions than revelations about itself. A look attentive, an impressive memory for your details, an almost clinical way of notice, changes in your mood. And that tends to make an impression, because being noticed is seductive, especially for those who have spent a long time feeling invisible. But here lies a sign that almost no one notices. Some people don't remember of your details because they created a bond. They remember why they are putting together a map. What calms you down? What activates you? Which makes you talk more? What makes you try to deserve space? Looks careful, but sometimes it's emotional tracking. Another subtle sign is the small test. It's almost ridiculous. It's so small. A delay without explanation. A colder response right after a moment of closeness. One ambiguous comment that leaves you slightly insecure. Nothing strong enough to justify confrontation, but enough to observe your reaction. And your reaction says it all. If you try to compensate, if you ask what happened, if you pretend you didn't feel it, if you blame yourself, if you double your kindness so as not to lose the connection, it is at this point that the dynamics begin to become asymmetrical. Because while you're inside the experience, trying to understand the mood, the other person can be outside of it, analyzing the result. And there is still a third sign, perhaps the most confusing. The mirrored depth. The person seems intense. It seems sensitive. He seems to understand you in a rare way. But looking closer, much of what she delivers is a reflection of what you yourself brought. She takes your pain, reorganize it into beautiful words, and return it with precision. It feels like intimacy. It seems meeting, but it is often well-executed mirroring. You feel like you've been seen, when in fact it was read. This happens because people with good social reading can adapt language, tone, rhythm, and even apparent values to create familiarity. In behavioral psychology interpersonal, this talks to processes of mirroring, social masking, and instrumental adaptation. The person does not enter to show themselves as they are. They enter to function well in the emotional environment he found. And when there's no real empathy sustaining. Therefore, adaptation stops being a connection and becomes a strategy. Keep this point, because it separates a lot of things. Not every tune is a bond. Sometimes, it's just social competence without affection. Anyone who follows conversations like this has generally felt this strangeness at some point. Time. The feeling that there was something wrong in the air, but nothing concrete enough to name. And that's perhaps the most disturbing feature of these signs. They don't hurt at all. Immediate. They confuse. They get tired. They make you think too much and feel blame too soon. Until one day the question changes. You stop trying to understand the person. and he starts trying to understand why he was always adjusting around her. This is when many masks begin to relax. Don't fall, to relax. And that's exactly where these people's next move becomes more dangerous. The mask almost never falls off at once. She loosens up. This is a decisive detail because many people expect a big moment of revelation. Wait for the moment when the cold person will finally show himself clearly, almost theatrical, as if the character ended and the truth appeared in its entirety before their eyes. But in real life, it almost never happens like that. What happens is more subtle, cleaner, harder to prove. Once the person understands that you are already emotionally involved, that you have already started justifying strangeness, that she has already invested too much energy to get out without internal conflict, you no longer need to sustain the same level of effort. Perfect attention begins to waver. Impeccable listening loses consistency. Calculated delicacy gives way to small gestures of indifference that, some time before, would not appear. And that is deeply confusing. Because it doesn't feel like a break. It just seems like a phase change. You think maybe she's tired, under pressure, distracted, more comfortable, less intense because the relationship has matured. And in healthy relationships, this can even happen. Not every change of pace is manipulation. But there is an important difference here. When the mask relaxes into a cold dynamic, emotional truth no longer emerges. Surge administration. The person stops conquering you and starts managing you. Manage your expectations. Manage your need. Manage how much you give. Manage how much you distance yourself to keep your search active. That's why so many people describe this moment as a silent loss of ground. There was no direct hit. There was an invisible repositioning. Before, you felt presence. Now feel calculation in the rhythm. Before, there was enough heat to create a bond. Now, there are enough cells to maintain connection. And the most disturbing thing is that this control often works precisely because it switches signs. One day, away. On the other, emotional precision. One moment, coolness. In the following, an exact phrase that disarms you again. This impedes clarity. You can't close internal diagnosis because there is always a gesture that seems to contradict the suspicion. This kind of ambiguity is arresting. Not because it's love, but because the human brain tends to hold on even more to what becomes intermittent. What comes and goes with measure produces more rumination, more attempts at meaning, more effort to recover the initial state. And that's where manipulation becomes normalized without needing to declare yourself. This channel exists to look precisely at this type of gray area, not to generate cheap paranoia, but to illuminate what usually goes unnoticed when mask doesn't fall off. It just relaxes. Whoever is here knows that human behavior most danger does not always enter through violence. It often comes down to precision. And when you realize this late, the pain doesn't just come from what the other person did. It comes from the discovery that you were adapting little by little. He accepted less. He was doubting himself more. He called a phase what was perhaps already a method. In the next step, however, an important and often forgotten truth emerges. The people who most fall into this type of dynamic are not always the weakest. They are often the most emotionally honest. There is an extra cruelty in certain cold relationships. They make the victim feel guilty by the opening itself, as if having believed was the main mistake, as if you had been sincere, available, affectionate, sensitive, had been a character flaw. And it isn't. This needs to be very clear. Emotionally honest people don't enter into dynamics like this because they are foolish. They enter because they still operate with human logic. A logic in which listening means interest, where presence means intention, where delicacy means consideration, in which someone who seems to understand your pain is not secretly converting these pains at the point of access. That's the shock, because those who are genuine tend to imagine that the other person is also playing the same game, emotional. There may even be differences in rhythm, language, intensity, but still thus there is the basic assumption of mutual humanity, possible reciprocity, from minimal truth. But it doesn't always exist. And when it doesn't exist, The most open person tends to be at a disadvantage right from the start, precisely because of its best qualities. She really feels it. Listening too true. It involves. Try to understand nuances. Give it one more chance because you know the human complexity. He tolerates ambiguity because he knows that everyone carries wounds. Translates inconsistencies as pain. Translates distance as fear. Translates coldness as difficulty of expression. Do you notice the trap? Virtue becomes a loophole. Empathy becomes exposure. Maturity becomes a delay in naming what is wrong. And maybe this touches a lot of people who are listening now in a silent way. Because there is people who spent years thinking they fell into these dynamics out of simple need, weakness, or naivety, when in fact what was in them was a real capacity to bond. There was faith in the connection. There was a willingness to build something without cynicism. The problem was never feeling too much. The problem was finding someone who used your affection as material for use. Hold it tight. Because this phrase changes the place of blame. And it also changes the place of reconstruction. Anyone caught by someone like that doesn't need to turn to stone to protect themselves. No need kill sensitivity. You don't have to become cold to never be hurt again. This is one of saddest effects of these experiences. Convincing good people that to survive, they will have to lose precisely what was most alive. But real protection does not come from hardening the soul. It comes from refining perception. To learn that depth is not measured by how quickly someone accesses your pains. That connection is not proven by the intensity of reading. Who really cares? It does not turn your vulnerability into a test, currency, or control tool. Whoever is here, in this type of conversation, has generally realized that the world is not divided between obvious monsters and innocent people. The reality is more uncomfortable, quieter, more ambiguous, and exactly for this reason, it needs to be observed more lucidly. Because in the end, cold people choose carefully, but you can also choose differently after seeing it. And when that awareness arrives, something changes forever. You stop calling destiny what was born from strategic reading, and you finally begin to recognize the value of those who don't study you to get in. But he respects you enough not to invade. In the end, the biggest mistake is to imagine that all emotional danger comes with a threat. Not always. Sometimes he comes too carefully, calmly too much, with a reading almost. Perfect understanding of who you are when you let your guard down. And that's why cold people confuse so much, because they don't need to break the door. Often they enter because he opened it because he believed he was faced with understanding. This is the point that changes everything. The problem isn't just that certain people watch you before choosing. Oh, the real problem is that they observe without really getting involved, capture your patterns without, assume the human weight of what they discover. They decorate their pain without honoring the delicacy of having access to them. And when someone does that, the relationship stops being a date. It becomes an operation. It hurts to realize that. It hurts to remember conversations that seemed profound and now sound calculated. It hurts to revisit moments when you called intimacy something that maybe was just reading need. It hurts mainly because no one likes to admit that they were understood by someone who wasn't there to care. But there is a quiet strength to this discomfort, the strength to start seeing. Because once you see this pattern, certain presences no longer seem mysterious and begin to seem predictable. You notice interest too quickly, a too perfect a tune, the listening that collects everything and offers little of itself, the intensity, which does not build security, only dependence on interpretation, and, little by little, the charm loses space for lucidity. Maybe that's why so many people avoid conversations like this, because they don't offer easy comfort. They require revision. They require courage to look back without romanticizing that hurt. They require maturity to understand that not every person who understands you, he deeply perceived you with love. And anyone who follows reflections like this knows this. We are not here to pretend that the human behavior is simple. We are here to look at what is behind of masks, to name what a lot of people felt, but couldn't explain. For create awareness before repetition becomes destiny. So keep it. Being watched is not the same as being loved. Being deciphered is not the same as being welcomed. Being chosen is not the same as being valued. Sometimes it just means someone saw an unlocked emotional door in you. And perhaps this is the most disturbing part of all. Cold people don't always look for the most beautiful, brightest, or strongest person. They often look for more accessible to the type of control they know how to exercise. If this script sparked any memories in you, write the word in the comments, "I observed." This helps transform perception into consciousness. And I really want to know your opinion. Do you believe that these people already know who they are going to target? Or do you just test until you find someone who gives in? On channels like this, comments are not detail. They reveal patterns that many people live in silence. And if you know someone who still confuses strategic attention with real affection, share this content. Sometimes a single realization arrives before the next mistake. Because in the end, the difference between falling again and breaking the cycle may lie in something very simple. Notice the look of someone who doesn't come closer to meet you, but to choose you.